So my name is Carrie Ritchie. I'm the president-elect of CPA, and it is my greatest honor to introduce my good friend, Dr. Ada Sinacore. Ada's CV is incredibly long, and I was told to keep this tight. So I won't talk about all the many, many things that Ada has done in the different careers, but I will talk about all the different lives she's changed. Ada has been a long time and outspoken champion of social justice and human rights. And Ada has changed lives because of that. She is a brilliant, thoughtful, and thoroughly engaging leader for the CPA. During her tenure as president, she's been one of the most accomplished scholars, and she is also one of the kindest humans you will ever meet. It is my privilege and my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Ada Sinacore.
Thank you, Carrie. Carrie is very, very special, and the association is very fortunate to have her as the incoming president, and I'm very fortunate that I get to work with you as past president, so thank you. I had them print this in big print so I wouldn't have to wear my glasses. Bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome everyone to the CPA Annual Convention. Mio nome, Ada Luisa Malca Scarinze Lamberta Malspina Sinacore. Most people call me Ada or Ada. I'm comfortable with both. I've been president of the Canadian Psychological Association since June 2021. I'm very excited to be here with you in person and look forward to reconnecting with those of you I know and meeting those of you I do not know over the course of the next few days and at the presidential reception. To begin, I'd like to say that it has been a privilege to serve as the president of CPA over the course of this past year and during these challenging times. I have done my best to lead with compassion and courage. And I hope you take the time to come to the AGM and hear about the many actions that CPA has taken this year. One area which I am particularly proud is the work related to human rights and social justice. That said, I think it is particularly important to note that Canadian Psychological Association Convention is always in the month of June, which has become a month to recognize Indigenous history and international pride. While during this talk, I will be focusing in part, on International Pride Month, in this moment, I want to acknowledge Indigenous History Month, and I encourage each and every one of you, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, to take action to sincerely acknowledge Indigenous histories and the Indigenous peoples of Canada. Today, I will focus my address on psychology's role in human rights and social justice. As some of you may know, human rights and social justice work is near and dear to my heart for many reasons. I truly believe we all have an important role to play in improving the world for all peoples and all communities. However, human rights work is challenging, and different people approach it in different ways. And there is some controversy in the field of psychology about the importance of this work. Personally, I believe at this point in time in Canadian history, it is particularly important for us to review psychology's role in human rights. Water. Thanks, Lisa. In 1948, the United Nations put forth the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thus, discussions about human rights are not new. But progress towards achieving equity and justice has been slow, with much work left to be done. The Declaration enshrines a number of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, such as the right to safety, to an adequate standard of living, to health, to housing, to education, and to access to the results of science and culture, including psychological science. Importantly, the Declaration states that people are entitled to these rights, and I quote, without distinction of any kind. The United Nations Human Rights Council identified numerous human rights abuses in Canada, such as violations of the freedom of expression, the Indian Act, the condition of Indigenous people, the missing and murdered Indigenous women, violence against women, prison conditions, and excessive use of police force. Other present and historic injustices not highlighted by the UNHRC report are poverty, food insecurity, homelessness, the treatment of 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples, access to clean water, and disparities in education. These injustices and disparities continue to be prevalent and have been exacerbated by the pandemic. Though the pandemic has brought discussions about social justice and human rights offenses into the forefront, the political response to the pandemic and the protests that ensued have highlighted continuing injustices experienced by Indigenous populations, racialized people, ethnocultural groups, women, 2S LGBTQIA+ populations, immigrants, refugees, vulnerable youth, people with disabilities, prison populations, and seniors. And I am sure there are more. All of these human rights offenses and other oppressive systems warrant attention from psychology. Psychology as a discipline and psychologists as individuals have a responsibility to address human rights. The APA Task Force on Human Rights states that members of society have the right to access and benefit from psychological services and knowledge. The research and practice of psychology should protect all people from discrimination and mistreatment. APA is not alone in this position. Organizations such as the International Council of Psychologists, the Global Network of Psychologists for Human Rights, and the Psychology Coalition at the United Nations maintain a similar stance. As well, the CPA Code of Ethics highlights psychologists' responsibility to vulnerable persons and people and clearly states that, quote, respect for people and persons also includes concepts of distributive and social justice. As such, the CPA Code of Ethics enshrines human rights and social justice as an ethical imperative. Not everyone agrees on psychology's role in human rights, and there is a debate as to whether all psychological science has a role. In my mind, the answer to this question is an emphatic yes. All areas of psychology and psychological science have a role in human rights. I hope that by the end of this address, you will understand why I take this position. Moreover, the reality on the ground is that human rights offenses within Canada are on the rise. A review of Stats Canada March 2022 report clearly indicates that crimes motivated by hatred increased for Black, Jewish, East, South, and Southeast Asians, Indigenous peoples, and 2S LGBTQIA+ populations. It also indicated that hate crimes targeting Black and Jewish populations were the most commonly reported by police, followed by those against East and Southeast Asian populations, and those targeting sexual orientation. Human rights issues that have affected me directly are specifically related to my Jewish and queer identities. B'nai B'rith, an organization that monitors anti-Semitic incidents against Jewish people, reported that in Canada, there were 2,799 recorded incidences of anti-Semitism in 2021, 8 per day against Jewish people. Just recently, in Toronto, a man was arrested for bringing a gun to a Jewish school. He assaulted a staff member and shouted, "I want to kill the Jews." Fortunately, he was caught before any lives were lost. As a Jewish person, I have experienced these violations firsthand. For example, when a Jewish elementary school library and the Jewish Federation were bombed in Montreal. When I was the music director for the Dora Wasserman Yiddish Theater in the early 2000s, when we traveled to Vienna to perform, we had guards to protect us from violence. When I was in Spain with my adult daughters in 2018, we had to go to a secret location to celebrate Shabbat with the Jewish community in Madrid. When Quebec passed Bill C-21, indicating I could no longer wear religious symbols such as a Hamsa or Magen David if I were to work in schools, which I do on a regular basis. When I enter a synagogue and I need to go through security and have my bag searched to ensure that I'm not bringing in a weapon. And most recently, during the pandemic, swastikas were painted on the door of a synagogue I frequent. Additionally, as a queer person, I have endured homophobic and genderphobic discrimination. As previously mentioned, I think it is important to acknowledge that we are having this convention in June, which is International Pride Month. Thus, I would like to take a moment to talk about the significance of pride as it relates to relates to human rights, and the complexity of what it means to many 2S LGBTQIA+ people and communities. From what I can glean, I am the first queer person to be the president of the Canadian Psychological Association. Thank you. Given psychology's historic negative treatment of members of queer communities, this first matters, as I have been told many times by 2S LGBTQI+ psychologists and students. As such, I feel I would be remiss if I did not discuss the significance of pride at this moment in time, and especially as it relates to human rights. Though pride is important, it is also important to recognize that 2S LGBTQIA+ people live their lives every day, all year long, not just in June. For the purposes of this discussion, I will use the word queer, as an overarching term. Though I know for many, this term can be problematic, especially for older generations. However, repeating the acronym will be difficult. Thus, I am choosing this term respectfully and thoughtfully. I'm going to contextualize this discussion with my personal experience so you understand that what I'm saying comes from the whole of who I am as an academic, a scholar, and a person in the world. When I first came out, in no way did I think I would ever utter the word queer, as it was a term used against members of my communities and myself when we were being harassed, violated, or even arrested by the police. It was also used by perpetrators of physical, sexual, and other forms of violence to justify their abuse against us, myself included. However, today it has been reclaimed by some, has become a term used by many members of the communities. Pride. Pride, though a celebration, can also be a time of deep sadness, mourning, and reflection for members of queer communities. I am sure that some of you are aware that Pride started as a way to honor the Stonewall Uprising that took place in New York City beginning on June 28, 1969, where police entered the Stonewall Inn with clubs, masks, and shields and began to beat up and arrest its patrons. At one point, an officer hit a woman over the head with a club, and she shouted to onlookers to act. Patrons and onlookers started throwing pennies at the police in rebellion, which turned into full-scale riots ensuing for 6 days. The Stonewall Inn was, and still is, a gay club in Greenwich Village in New York City. Up until 1966, it was illegal to serve alcohol to, quote, homosexuals. So the Stonewall Inn was a private bottle club where patrons brought their own alcohol or were served alcohol under the table. Even after 1966, most LGBT clubs did not have liquor license, as it was difficult for them to obtain one. Nonetheless, it was unique. Nonetheless, Stonewall was unique in that its patrons were gay men, lesbians, drag queens, butch dykes, homeless LGBT people, and others. It was also unique because dancing was allowed. Police raids on gay bars in the 60s were a regular event. Arrests were justified due to the serving of alcohol and laws that prohibited same-sex people from kissing, dancing, holding hands, and all sexual activities. There was also the gender-appropriate statute, where it was against the law to be wearing less than 3 articles of clothing appropriate to your gender. Officers would take drag queens and butch dykes into the bathroom and strip search them and arrest them for being inappropriately dressed. By the way, I was subjected to this law for being inappropriately dressed. And accordingly, I'm inappropriately dressed today and every day. The Stonewall Uprising sparked the development of a number of activist groups, such as the Gay Activist Alliance, the Gay Liberation Front, Radical Lesbians, and the Street Transvestite Action Revolutions. Over the course of the 1970s and well into the 80s, these groups worked to get anti-discrimination legislation passed. In Canada, it is merely 50 years since the beginning of the decriminalization of homosexuality. Though there has been much progress, we are still fighting against discriminatory laws today. However, as some of you may know, I am from New York. In 1977, at 17 years of age, I moved out of my parents' house, went to university, and soon thereafter came out for the first time, which really meant coming in to queer spaces that would accept me, and did not mean telling people who I was regularly with about my sexual orientation. I came out just 3 years after homosexuality was removed from the DSM and replaced by individuals distressed over one's homosexual orientation, which remained in the DSM in various forms until 2013. Now, the term homosexual is considered taboo and not one used in many English-speaking queer communities because it was a diagnosis that caused serious, serious harm. As well, I came out just 8 years after the Stonewall Uprising, during a time when it was extremely dangerous to be queer. And I was targeted and abused on a regular basis. In these conditions, how could someone not be distressed by their sexual orientation? Back then, and even moving forward, many people of my generation and older, myself included, lived a double life, both in and out of the closet, to mitigate the abuses and violence we endured from police, at our workplaces, from our landlords, from our families, the general public, and anyone who questioned our right to exist. The Stonewall Uprising was only 52 years ago. And as I said, it was the beginning of the gay liberation movement. In fact, the first Pride Parade was called Christopher Street Liberation Day and was planned somewhat subversively by a group of activists. Sometimes we forget that there are some of us here today who lived through this history, who fought very hard so that us LGBTQIA+ people have the rights they have today. We also forget that queer people of my generation and older carry many scars due to the years of discrimination and systemic violence, and may be less likely to seek out social, health, or psychological services. As such, queer people of my generation and older have a different story to tell than younger generations, and maybe a different way of approaching how we are out to others and our identities. For example, we use different terminology to discuss our identities than the terminology used today. Words like genderqueer and gender non-binary did not exist when I first came out. I was a butch dyke, or gender bender. How we negotiate pronouns, and to a certain extent still negotiate pronouns, was very, very different than the discussions of today. And for some, if they were brave, in 1977, their pronouns became Z and Zer. Today, I often struggle with how to present my identity, because my identity is not easily characterized by the words in the acronym, just as it was not easily characterized when I was much younger. Leslie Feinberg, in Zer's 1993 novel, Stone Butch Blues, and 1997 book entitled Transgender Warriors Making History from Joan of Arc to Dennis Rodman, masterfully portrays the complexity and challenges of having an identity that is outside of cis and trans. Oftentimes, when I am with my gay friends of my generation, we go back to the old terminology, reclaiming our identities in ways we do not feel safe doing publicly or outside of our generation's queer spaces where we are situated. However, when we have these conversations, it reminds us of our histories and stories, because we often fear that queer history is not taught or talked about. Our identities and our stories will be erased. I was also living in New York City during the heart of the AIDS epidemic, when AIDS was called the homosexual plague, and religious groups touted that it was God's way of punishing us for living a sinful life. Many of my dear friends and a cousin died of AIDS in the 80s. And when I moved to Montreal with 2 young daughters, ages 1 and 3, in 1994, no doctor would see me without an AIDS test. Recently, a few weeks ago, a gay male friend, the same age as me, and I decided to take a motorcycle ride to Ottawa. The gas was running low, and we were forced to stop in a small town in Ontario. We pulled into a gas station, and the attendant came out to assist us. Upon going to pay, my friend made a very silly joke, which this man took as an invitation to spout homophobic, heterosexist, and misogynist comments about his wife. My friend then put his arm around me, gave me a big kiss on the lips, and said, "My wife is not like that." While we both knew his husband was working in Montreal. Then we got back on the bike. He leaned back and asked me if I was okay. And I said, yes, fine. And then he said, I thought it would be safest to play it straight. Finally, on Monday, when I arrived here in Calgary and was walking from my plane to get my luggage, I walked across the pride colors painted on the floor, and immediately thereafter made a left to go into the restroom. I was followed into the restroom by a security guard, who I only realized was there until I came out of the stall to wash my hands. While I was washing my hands, the guard glared at me and subsequently proceeded to follow me to the luggage carousel. The superficial symbolism of pride colors painted on the floor was not lost on me. Why am I telling you these stories? Because it is very important to understand that Pride represents not just a time for 2S LGBTQIA+ communities to come together in solidarity and celebration, but it is a time to acknowledge our histories. And while some people hang flags, go to parades, and paint rainbows, believing it's supportive, in my experience, in most cases, these acts are purely performative and do not bring about substantive change. In actuality, most people I have spoken to do not know what the colors of the pride flag represent or why the new Progress Pride flag was created. The colors matter. Red means life. Orange, healing. Yellow, sunlight. Green, nature. Blue, serenity. And purple, spirit. And the new Progress Pride flag, brown and black are for people of color, and light blue, white, and pink are for trans people. While these colors are not sufficient to acknowledge all of the diversity among 2S LGBTQIA+ peoples, it is important we at least recognize what they mean. And if we're going to wave that flag or we're going to paint that flag, we should know what we're waving and what we're painting. For some people, pride can be a dangerous time if they are confronted by individuals who come to pride to be disruptive, abusive, or hecklers. In the mid-1990s through the early 2000s, in Montreal, when I would go to Pride with my daughters, oftentimes when I returned home to my house, my house and or my car was vandalized. How do you explain that to your children? In recent years, I have opened my home to members of the emerging and young adult queer community as a safe house. So if they are being harassed during Pride, they have a place to go so they do not have to take the risk of returning home alone. It's always interesting to see the face of the harasser when I am standing on the sidewalk waiting. In these instances, my butch stance and gray hair can be very powerful. In addition to a celebration, Pride is a time to acknowledge the historic and ongoing discrimination faced by queer people in Canada and around the world. 77 countries criminalize same-sex relations, while 92% of Commonwealth citizens live in jurisdictions where same-sex activity is criminalized. Pride is a time to recognize we have a great deal of work left to do in Canada to ensure the human rights of 2S LGBTQIA+ people. According to EGAL and Stats Canada's 2020 reports, in Canada, an average of 45% of homeless youth identify as being part of the 2S LGBTQIA+ communities. In Canada, 75% of trans and gender-diverse adults consider suicide, and 43% have attempted suicide at one point. 49% of trans people polled in Ontario earn less than $15,000 per year. In Canada, 75% of trans people have no government-issued ID, and 34% live in poverty. In Canada, 49% of educators report hearing homophobic comments at their school, 64% of LGB and 74% of trans and gender-diverse youth report being unsafe at school. In Canada, 60% of healthcare providers report never receiving training for cultural competence regarding trans and gender-diverse populations, and 50% report never receiving training in relation to LGBTQ populations. In Canada, 50% of queer seniors are afraid to be out to their healthcare providers, and 52% fear being forced back into the closet if they enter residential care. In Canada, 42% of queer seniors are afraid they will outlive their money, the money they save for retirement, compared to 25% of heterosexuals. In Canada, 53% of crimes targeting gender diversity and sexual orientation are extremely violent, targeting victims starting as young as the age of 15, with many individuals experiencing violence more than once. In Canada, 2S LGBTQIA+ people are 3 times more likely to experience physical and/or sexual assault than their heterosexual counterparts. 57% report experiences of sexual violence in public, such as harassment, threatening comments, gestures, and threatening body language. And 2021 marked the highest number of murders of trans people recorded since 2008. These numbers are staggering. And the challenges are increasingly complex when you add intersecting identities such as race, ethnicity, religion, disability, and indigeneity. If you review Stats Canada's Centre for Gender Diversity and Inclusion reports, you will notice that what I have reported here does not begin to come close to the discrimination faced by 2S LGBTQIA populations. As well, the statistics presented are perhaps lower than the actual statistics due to underreporting. Moreover, the data I am presenting is from before the pandemic, 2020. It is well documented that there has been an increase in sexual violence, assault, hate crimes, and other human violations over the course of the pandemic. Nonetheless, this information is the tip of the iceberg when we consider the discrimination, marginalization, and violence faced by queer populations. It is evident that every day in this country and around the world, the rights of 2S LGBTQI+ people are violated in profound ways. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, and I quote, "All humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. Everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and protection from unemployment. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, and necessary social services." Clearly, in this country, 2S LGBTQI+ people's human rights are systematically violated on a regular basis. Each day, every day, when I leave my home, I have to consider how I might be treated, both as a Jewish person due to anti-Semitism and as a queer person. I have many stories of mistreatment to tell, and many, many more which I hold privately. So today, on the 17th day of International Pride Month, I ask you to recognize the historic and current abuses and human rights offenses facing members of queer communities of all generations, and recognize their resiliency. I ask you to understand that Pride is much more than a celebration and has significant and lasting meaning. For some of us who have lived through and witnessed the historic evolution of pride, pride stands for our triumphs, for the battles we have fought and won. Pride also stands for our devastation over the fact that 2S LGBTQI+ individuals and communities are still experiencing violence and abuses in their homes, schools, workplaces, residences, and healthcare, as well as ongoing systemic discrimination, which we fought and continue to fight so hard to change. I march in the Pride Parade in Montreal every year, and I will again this year. Each year at the parade, there is a moment of silence to recognize all the people we have lost due to AIDS, neglect, systemic violence, murder, and death by suicide. It is amazing when the parade stops moving and the crowd of over 300,000 is silent. It brings me to tears every year. For some of us have many, many people to remember. In that moment of silence, I also reflect on how close I came in many instances to becoming one of those statistics, and how I dodged the bullets. So I stand before you as president of the Canadian Psychological Association, as a person who was diagnosed with a mental illness solely due to my gender and sexual orientation. I stand before you as a survivor of abusive psychological care when at the age of 25, I was subjected to conversion therapy and subsequently went back into the closet for a short period of time. I stand before you as somebody who has endured an inordinate amount of violence, discrimination, marginalization, bullying, and other abuses. And guess what? I am still standing. So when somebody says to me that psychology does not have a role in human rights work, I am momentarily rendered speechless. That while there is much work to do, CPA as an association has done some very important advocacy work, which has had a direct impact on the human rights in Canada, such as advocacy for marriage equity and for criminalizing conversion therapy, as well as its response to the report on truth and reconciliation and the creation of a board-level human rights committee, to name a few. However, CPA is not psychology. CPA is a membership organization and cannot do this work alone without the engagement of members. We are psychology. Each and every one of us. We have a responsibility to ensure the rights, human rights of all individuals and groups through our teaching, research, clinical practice, and advocacy. As a discipline, we are uniquely positioned to bring about systemic and lasting change when it comes to the kind of violence and discrimination I have been talking about here. We are also uniquely positioned to understand the short and long-term impact of the trauma that is experienced by marginalized individuals and communities. I aver that psychologists and the psychological community have an ethical responsibility to speak out about human rights violations that occur every day, over and over in this country. The psychological community has the knowledge and the science to address these offenses in order to reduce harm and the negative mental health outcomes so clearly delineated by the social determinants of health. Psychologists can do this work at the individual level by understanding how human rights violations affect their clients and students, and by recognizing that some older clients may not be comfortable sharing their stories due to histories of discrimination and abuse. Psychologists can do this work as educators and can bring human rights discussions to research, teaching, and clinical supervision. Psychologists can ensure they are adequately prepared to do this work, prepared to work with a diversity of clients and students they serve, and recognize becoming culturally humble, literate, and competent is developmental and a lifelong process and commitment. Psychologists can do this work at the systemic level by using psychological science to advocate for systemic and political change. Psychological scientists can do this work as researchers by addressing how their research can be used for the betterment of society or can be misused and cause harm. Psychological scientists need to attend to the whole of the potential impacts of their research societally, individually, and systemically. I recognize that human rights work is difficult and exhausting. As such, we must approach this work with an orientation to collaboration, allyship, kindness, and compassion. Oftentimes, in my experience, individuals take an adversarial position when embarking on this work, assuming that they will be met with negativity or rejection, or that they do not have a person who wants to work with them. In my experience, starting from an adversarial place does not lend itself to developing allyship and collaboration. Disagreement is not the problem. And controversy is necessary for innovation and change. However, having respectful, difficult dialogues is also necessary to bring about positive and lasting change. I try to approach these dialogues from a place of compassion and learning in order to best understand the concerns being presented. However, I am not perfect, and sometimes this type of work leads to misunderstandings we need to try to rectify. I have devoted my entire career to feminist, social justice, and human rights research, scholarship, advocacy, and activism. As someone who has personally experienced and witnessed so many human rights violations, I understand both the individual and systemic challenges to bring about change. I am one of the lucky ones because somehow, despite all odds, I figured out how to both survive and thrive. As a result, I do not believe I have a choice but to advocate for human rights in psychology. As I said, human rights work in psychology, human rights work is hard and it requires courage. I truly hope that I have modeled courage by being out and sharing a piece of a story I have very rarely told with you today. In conclusion, I challenge you to deeply engage with human rights and social justice work regardless of your area of expertise or specialization. I ask you to be reflexive of your own biases in places where you need to learn and grow to become increasingly culturally humble and literate. I appeal to you to ponder how the work you do, be it community work, research, teaching, or clinical practice, has an important role in moving psychology to be a discipline which centralizes human rights and social justice such that it serves to improve the lives of all peoples and communities. Psychology has the power to bring about lasting systemic change. We are psychology, all of us. Each and every one of us, in our own way, can make a huge difference if we act collaboratively with compassion and courage. At this time, I'd like to take a moment. I told you this is going to be the hard part. I'm looking at you, David. At this time, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge my wonderful daughters, who I love dearly, who are streaming this talk today. Louisa and Sarah, who has lived with me in queer and Jewish communities that I and we inhabit their entire lives, and who have witnessed some of my story and perhaps heard some of it for the first time today. I recognize that they also have their own stories, which are not mine to tell. I would also like to acknowledge my son-in-law, Sam, who loves my daughter with his full heart and has embraced my family and who puts up with me. I feel truly blessed. As well, I have to acknowledge David Danto for reinforcing my courage and encouraging me to tell this story today. On that note, I hope you all have a wonderful convention and take advantage of all the opportunities this convention has to offer. I look forward to seeing you over the course of the next few days and at the presidential reception. Thank you, and happy Pride.